So far, Switch 2 sales news has pretty much been a story of triumph and glee from Nintendo's point of view, but in the last few days, there has been one discordant note uttered into the void with an unattributed third party publisher quote that has ricocheted around the internet for describing the sales numbers of their third party Switch 2 title as below our lowest estimates relative to hardware sales. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that quote because one unattributed quote from a few weeks after the console's release is really a terrible basis for any meaningful discussion, but I do want to look more broadly about the prospects for Switch 2 as a vehicle for selling third-party games in 2025 and beyond. If it's the case that third-party titles are selling relatively poorly, and it's a big if, what might the logic be and what is the prognosis? What might their expectations have been, and what might the practical consequences be? And what about the Nintendo of it? Now, I'm always cautious tipping my toe into third party territory because I am about as far from a third party game player as it is possible to be. I don't have all that much time to play games, and with vanishingly rare exceptions, I generally find Nintendo's first party offers more reliably entertaining, so I don't venture out beyond those all that often. I dabble a little more with indies, but that's a bit different. Therefore, I'm basing this off more general principles than specific knowledge of any individual title and its performance. However, I think it's worth noting that while I'm probably relatively unusual in the gaming space as a whole, I suspect that of the extreme early adopters of Switch 2, that situation is a lot more common. Most people don't buy a new Nintendo console to buy ports of titles already available on other systems. Anyone hungry for those titles would already have gone and purchased the titles on any of the many other venues on which it's possible to play those games. In fact, given that the profile of early adopters will be people more interested in new tech generally, it's very likely that these kinds of people will already own these games on other systems if they have the slightest interest in them, and therefore are unlikely to want to play a version on the Switch 2 that likely runs less well. Moreover, even if you are waiting for a particular title to play on the go, the launch month is by definition one of the trickiest times to sell such a game. You have a small install base who have just splashed out a large amount on a brand new console, and now you are going to put your game against all the best stuff that's been put out there at launch, first and third party. Even if customers are broadly interested in picking up third party titles, it's not necessarily the case that they can rush to make every purchase. Especially as game prices rise, it's natural for people to show a degree of caution, and frankly, many third parties have earned themselves a reputation for having price drops like a stone very early on. I loved Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, but I waited out for Sparks of Hope because I knew it would drop in price, and my only regret really was that I didn't wait even longer for a deeper price cut. Ubisoft, in this sense, are kind of their own worst enemy, and while there's a sort of logic in trying to balance the books for a game on the backs of the keenest audience members, that only works if you're selling to a keen group of people and to not particularly financially savvy audience members as that. For that matter, many of these titles are available cheaper on other consoles as well, which doesn't exactly help. Another complicating factor oft cited is, of course, the game keycard controversy. Personally, I have very mixed feelings about these, as I've covered in a separate video, and I would probably want to steer clear of them at least for a while. There may be circumstances where I guess I would consider such a purchase if I thought the facility to move games with a cartridge was going to be useful, or if there was a much better deal than a digital download would offer, but overall, it's a pretty unpleasant proposition as far as I can see. Now, I don't necessarily blame Nintendo for this, but it is ultimately a choice of third-party publishers as to whether they use the game keycards, and so they can't be exactly shocked when the market responds with a good deal of caution. I suspect that in time these will become normalized and people will eventually revert to their standard purchasing behavior, but it could take a long while, at least for those people who are engaged in the whole debate, which is going to be a small number out of the whole totality of the eventual switch to ownership block, but out of the early adopters, it's likely that quite a few people are turned on to this discussion. There will need to be a major game coming up, therefore, that for one reason or another, it makes sense to buy as a game key card to have people cross that psychological threshold, and that will be different for different people. Again, casual players of the sort that will populate the Switch 2's later audience base are likely to not care, but the kinds of engaged people who are buying a console in launch month are likely to have strong views one way or another, which doesn't help matters. So all of these factors are worth bearing in mind when it comes to the current state of third-party sales. But this is a very transient picture. I don't think the same issues will be anywhere near as problematic by the end of the 2025 holiday period, let alone a year from now or 2 years or more. The audience profile of the system will shift. People will have more time to buy more games, to buy gifts of games, and so on. I think in the medium term, the prognosis for third-party sales isn't significantly different from what publishers experienced on the original Switch. And moreover, it feels like these are going to be proportionate to effort. If Duskbloods underperforms, that would be really bad, and I hope exclusives like Fast Fusion do well in addition. I haven't got it yet, as I barely am keeping up with the current titles, but I do want to support Shiden, who seem to have been putting a really huge amount of effort into a fun and affordably priced racer. I've definitely seen some awesome reviews for it. However, the fact is that these higher effort exclusive games are always going to command more attention than afterthought ports, even of relatively major third-party titles. What will the Nintendo view of this be then? My guess is that they will tell any panicking partners to keep calm and carry on, both because that is the only sensible strategy and also because it happens to be the best solution. As I say, I expect most Switch 2 ports to do as well as would normally be expected over time. Clearly, this is slightly uncomfortable for Nintendo because they want to promote Switch 2 as a haven for third-party developers as well as for their first-party offerings, and it introduces an uncomfortable level of uncertainty for people wanting to bring over their games if they're not seeing the people who have supported the system at launch surfing away on tidal waves of cash. From Nintendo's point of view, they must have factored an element of all this in. But not all third-party companies are going to be run as Nintendo. Nintendo is large and can be pretty conservative and is willing to talk tough with fans, employees, and investors. If you're a smaller studio, big talk about how the Switch 2 port of your major title will change everything could lead to unrealistic projections. And by unrealistic projections, I just mean projections which use the Switch install base assumptions for a Switch 2 install base, with the only adjustments being scaling down the size of the player base, not taking into account the profile of these games, not taking into account the likelihood of whether they have the games on the other systems, and so on, all the stuff we've already discussed. Well, that could be a critical error. If they've used back-of-an-envelope calculations, and if shareholders are a little bit less patient than Nintendo shareholders have learned to be, then yeah, I could see some uncomfortable conversations happening in various boardrooms as quarterly results start to come out. Tangibly, if they've misjudged their numbers produced, they could find the dreaded prospect of copies of physical games being returned. If this is interpreted as a response to keycards, then it may make them think again, although since the alternative appears in many cases to be hugely expensive larger cards, with necessitated downloads anyway for those games that can't be compressed to file sizes the cards contains, there's more of a chance of big names deciding to bail on Switch 2 development anyway. If they feel burned, they may decide to look at more of a digital-only route, which in turn would expedite the demise of physical versions of games. I'm not sure how likely this is, but I could definitely see this becoming a vicious circle. The fact is, though, that there is no handheld system that has physical games in the same way as the Switch 2, so if they go for downloads, they're going to be hurting physical game stores primarily, who are already going to be hurting from the broad change to digital. This in turn might cause Nintendo to need to ramp up with some urgency the number of their own stores and pop-up locations, and perhaps to make deals with other electronic stores to stock more than just their games but other Nintendo accoutrements, so that they can have a bigger standing in the high street even if their third-party offerings ebb away. All of this does risk taking on a momentum of its own, but things have the potential to snap back just as quickly. A major internet outage as a result of attack on undersea cables somewhere in the world could move the dial in a completely different direction very quickly indeed. Therefore, it's very risky to try and extrapolate out from micro trends, even though I would expect game provision to look radically different by the end of Switch 2's life compared to the beginning. As for Nintendo, though, they have some degree of insulation from many of these risks. When they raised their game prices to $70 for Donkey Kong Bonanza and $80 for Mario Kart World, lots of people said that it would hurt Nintendo because their audience would buy fewer games. And I can see that argument, but it only really hurts Nintendo if those people buy fewer first-party games. If people balance their Switch 2 games budgets by skipping more third-party titles, then Nintendo actually has very little to fear at all. Sure, they get a cut of third-party titles on their system, but they get a far larger cut of the games they've actually developed themselves outright, and having people buy Nintendo content has a longer tail of benefits than just people owning a game that happens to be on the Switch 2, even if it's not actually a Nintendo title. The chances are that people will become interested in the merchandise if they buy first-party games, and if they're brought into Nintendo's ecosystem of apps and toys and films and whatever else, then the opportunity to upsell to people from first-party games is far greater than if they just happen to play third-party games on their Switch 2. Now, there is a limit, for now at least, as to how far Nintendo can push this. The risk is that third parties take their ball and go home, and Switch 2 ends up like the late Wii U or indeed the early Switch, having very little support. But this isn't enormously likely to be a problem either. Ultimately, these companies aren't motivated by playground loyalties to companies, but by commercial opportunities, and Switch 2 will likely have a larger player base, and that means that they will want to base themselves and their games on Switch 2. What Nintendo can claim is that, like in any good chess game, they thought many moves ahead. If third parties do well, they benefit. If third parties do less well, they can still build up their own first-party options and they can still benefit. If things go towards digital, they make more money and they benefit. If the trend snaps back to physical, they are still committed to allowing physical purchases most of the time, and because they would be one of the few companies left in the field making this offer, they benefit. Even if Switch 2 tanks and third parties turn away, they have a large amount of cash on hand, which could be used for assisting with, for example, game compression, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was a part of the vision of acquiring Port Studio Shiver Entertainment in 2024. I think Nintendo can claim to have covered themselves in the event of most major possibilities. And as for third-party publishers, in the scheme of things, Switch 2 has a tiny install base, and these numbers sold are going to be a rounding error on their balance sheets anyway. If in 6 months or a year's time the problems are still apparent, well, that will be an interesting day. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon, but if not, I appreciate you being here all the same, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.